I always try to get one decent solo hiking trip in before summer ends, and that year I had picked Sleeping Giant Provincial Park in Ontario. I had been there once before on a day hike, but never for a full overnight, let alone a solo multi-day trip. The place always stuck with me because of its rough cliffs, quiet inland lakes, and long winding trails that seemed to just vanish into the dense woods. I planned a 3-day trip, starting with a long hike into the peninsula and camping that first night just before the trail dropped down toward Lake Superior. My camp spot wasn't one of the designated backcountry sites, but I had found a good little clearing just off the trail and slightly above a rocky slope that led to a narrow pebble beach below. By the time I got there, the sun was hanging low. I had left mid-morning and made decent time, but the last few kilometers had been a real grind. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, and my legs were already starting to complain by the time I found the spot. Still, it felt like a good place to stop. The forest thinned just enough for my small green tent to squeeze in, and from the slope I could see the water through the trees. That made me feel a little less boxed in. I could even hear the lake's gentle washing against the shore through the wind in the leaves. It felt like a reward for getting that far on foot. I went through the normal routine: tent up, gear sorted, water filtered. I cooked a small meal using my canister stove and ate sitting on a flat rock a few feet away from my tent. I wasn't in any rush. That first night is always the weirdest. I've been camping plenty of times, but no matter how experienced I think I am, that first night alone in the woods always feels a bit off. Something about the way the forest wakes up after dark, how the air seems thicker and the woods sound more alive than during the day. It's never truly quiet. There's always something rustling, some small branch falling, some unknown animal moving around. But your brain, at least mine, starts painting those sounds into something else. Not a squirrel, but something worse. Not a bird landing in a tree, but a person sneaking around. It takes a night or two for my brain to rewire itself, to start recognizing those noises for what they are. That night, I couldn't quite get there. After cleaning up my food and sealing it in a dry bag, I walked it maybe 50 meters back into the woods and hung it up. I'm always pretty careful about that, even if I wasn't too worried about bears in that particular area. Once I was back, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up for the night. It was barely 9 p.m., but the sun had disappeared fully, and there wasn't much to do except lie back on my pad and try to drift off. Easier said than done. First, it was just the normal stuff. The forest was busy, way busier than I expected for late summer. I could hear crickets, cicadas, the occasional thump or thud of something falling. A light breeze kept shifting the branches, making them creak softly. But beneath all that, it felt like something was moving, not constantly, but in brief spurts, like the way you might hear footsteps in the distance, but never twice from the same direction. I tell myself it was probably just small animals, chipmunks, rabbits, maybe a fox nosing around. But I wasn't buying my own logic. I was still wide awake, just lying there, staring at the curve of the nylon roof above me. My ears were doing more work than my eyes. The longer I lay there, the louder everything seemed. It felt like the woods were pressing in tighter. The temperature had dropped fast, and the damp air coming in off the lake made the walls of the tent feel cold. I had my sleeping bag zipped up to my chest, but still felt exposed. I couldn't shake that feeling that something was out there watching. It wasn't a specific direction either. It was just the general sense of not being alone. My pulse started climbing and wouldn't settle. Then I heard it. Something heavy. Not close yet, but heavier than any bird or squirrel. Branches snapping. Not loudly, but enough. Sharp breaks of deadwood under weight. Then silence. Then again. But now closer. My brain shifted hard into fight or flight mode. Every sound felt amplified. Every creak of a branch or shift in the wind had me holding my breath. My thoughts weren't on wildlife anymore. They went somewhere worse, someone in the woods. Someone walking slowly toward my tent. Stupid, I know. It always is. But your brain doesn't care about logic when it feels like you're alone and vulnerable. I kept telling myself, you're just jumpy. You're not used to the woods again yet. Give it a day. You're fine. But my hands were clenched. My whole body was locked up. I didn't even move to check my watch or grab my headlamp. I just lay there and waited. Then something happened that pushed it over the edge. There was a loud crack, one of those deep thudding cracks like a branch breaking under full weight. Then the distinct clatter of rocks falling. Not a few either. A full spill of stone and grit sliding down a slope. It was close, right outside, right between the tent and the drop-off toward the beach. I jerked up and held my breath again. It was like something had slipped, or charged, or misstepped. But either way, something large had just taken a tumble. My fingers finally got the nerve to grope around until they found my flashlight. I clicked it on and waited a second, still frozen. The sound had stopped. Nothing else was moving out there. Or maybe it was, and I couldn't hear it over the blood pumping in my ears. After another few seconds, I reached out with my other hand and unzipped the front door of the tent just enough to peek out. The cold air hit me fast. My breath showed in the beam of the flashlight. I shined it low, sweeping across the packed dirt and pine needles in front of me, then toward the slope. And there it was, a full-sized elk. Not moving at first. I thought maybe it had broken something. It was awkwardly splayed on the edge of the slope, hooves scrambling, flanks heaving, trying to get back to its feet. It had clearly slipped, probably trying to walk along the edge in the dark. I watched, stunned, as it finally shoved itself upright and stood still for a few seconds, wobbling slightly. Then it took off, staggering down the slope and out of the light. I heard the last few rocks rattle and slide down toward the lake. Then nothing. No more steps. No breathing. Just the woods again. I sat back inside my tent and zipped it up. I didn't lie back down. Not for a long time. I sat cross-legged with the flashlight off, holding it in both hands like a lifeline, listening for any sign of the elk returning or something else moving through the dark. But the moment had passed. It was just the woods again. Just me and the long night ahead. Eventually I lay down again, but I don't think I really slept. Not real sleep, just a few shallow dips in and out of awareness. By the time morning light started creeping in through the trees, I was already wide awake and unzipped the tent before the sun had even cleared the lake. The air was cold, damp. Everything outside was soaked in dew. I stood up slowly, legs stiff, and walked over to the slope. There were deep drag marks in the dirt and pebbles leading down, along with a few broken branches. I couldn't see the elk from where I was, but the trail it had left was unmistakable. I stood there for a few minutes, just staring at it. Not scared anymore, just coming down from the leftover adrenaline that had pooled in my blood all night. I had made it through the worst of it. Nothing had come for me. Nothing had watched me. It was just a clumsy animal, the kind that have just as much trouble navigating steep terrain in the dark as I would. Still, I packed up quickly that morning. Not because I was spooked exactly, but because I felt wired, too jumpy to sit around. I didn't even make coffee, just filled my bottles, stowed my gear, and got back on the trail with stiff legs and a tight jaw. As I hiked out that morning, I kept looking over my shoulder more than usual. Every snapping twig had me turning my head, but I was getting used to it. By the time the sun was higher and the trees started warming, I could feel myself settling again. The woods weren't any quieter than the night before, but they sounded different now, less threatening, more natural. My brain had finally started to adjust. I ended up doing 2 more nights on that trip. Both of them were uneventful. I saw a black bear at a distance one morning and heard wolves howling the second night, far off across the lake, but it all felt normal by then. The fear from that first night faded into something smaller, still sharp in my mind, but less threatening now that I had context. Looking back on it, I think what got me the most wasn't the elk itself. It was the idea that something big was out there and I didn't know what. That half minute of not knowing, that space between hearing and seeing, is what did the damage. That's the part one still think about sometimes when I'm alone in the tent on a new trail. But I didn't die in the backwoods of Canada. I didn't get stalked or attacked or lost. I saw an elk fall down a hill, and somehow that was scary enough. I don't think there's a way to explain what it's like to be truly alone in the woods unless you've done it. Really done it, off the grid, hours from cell service, with everything you need for survival carried on your back. No one to check in with, no background noise, no safety net. I wasn't new to it, but I still got rattled from time to time, and there's something about solitude that gets to you, especially when your brain decides to turn against you. The trip started out like most of mine do. I had a long weekend off and needed a reset. I'd been going too hard at work, not sleeping right, eating like crap, and just generally felt run down. There was this new trail system a few hours away. Nothing major, just a stitched-together loop of old logging roads and bush trails through Crown land that had been recently reopened and was mostly underused. It sounded perfect, quiet, wild, and with enough elevation changes to wear me out. I drove out early that morning, reached the makeshift parking area just before noon, and laced up my boots under cloudy skies. There was a light wind pushing through the trees already, and everything smelled damp and rich with pine and wet earth. It had rained the day before, and the trail was soft and patchy in spots. Not muddy, but slick enough to make me watch my steps. By mid-afternoon, I'd gotten in about 10 kilometers. The trail followed a ridge for a while before dropping down into a valley with a slow, winding creek that cut through mossy rocks and shallow pools. I decided to camp somewhere near there, up above the flood zone, but not too far from water. I found a good flat section off to the side, maybe 30 meters off trail. It was surrounded by big old spruce and maple trees, the ground soft and layered with years of needles and mulch. I set up my tent facing a small slope that looked down toward the creek. I liked being close to water, not just for the obvious reasons, but because I found the sound calming. Predictable, white noise in a forest that was otherwise alive with cracks and snaps and rustles that didn't always sound as harmless as they were. By the time I'd finished setting up, gathering a bit of kindling, filtering water, and boiling up dinner, it was getting close to dusk. I ate slowly, sitting on a thick fallen log, watching the light fade through the trees. I didn't see or hear anyone all day. I liked that. It made the place feel like it was mine, even just for a night. After cleaning up and hanging my food bag well away from camp, I crawled into the tent and zipped it tight. It was still early, but the light was almost gone, and there wasn't much else to do. I turned off my headlamp and lay back with my arms behind my head, breathing in the mix of cool air and tent plastic. And then, just like that, the switch flipped. It always happened that way. I'd feel fine 1 minute, then uneasy the next, with no clear cause. My eyes adjusted to the dark inside the tent, but my ears started working harder. Every crack of a branch outside, every flutter of leaves, every distant snap felt sharp and pointed. My thoughts turned sour. I started thinking about how isolated I was, how no one knew exactly where I was, how I'd passed no other hikers all day. And that's when the mental spiral begins. I call it the shift. Suddenly, I wasn't imagining deer or raccoons outside my tent anymore. Now it was someone walking around, watching, waiting. Of course it wasn't, but try telling your brain that when you're alone in the woods in a thin nylon bubble. I tried to focus on my breathing, tried to steady it. I thought about the layout of my gear, how fast I could get my boots on, how far I'd have to run if something actually happened. It was ridiculous, but it was also real in the moment. I lay there for what felt like an hour, half asleep but still alert, drifting in and out of shallow dreams that kept snapping back into wakefulness. Every time a twig popped, I jolt. Sometime well into the night, I heard something that broke the usual pattern. It wasn't sharp, but it was heavy. A thud, not close but not far. And then silence. Then again, a slow crunch of leaves, deliberate and irregular. Not the patter of a small animal. Something with weight. Something walking. Something moving slowly. My pulse hit a spike. I didn't move, just listened. The sound stopped again, and I lay there trying to isolate it in my head. Distance, direction, pace. But it was impossible to tell through the layers of trees. I kept telling myself it was an animal. It had to be. Maybe a moose wandering through the valley. But moose are usually louder, more obvious. This wasn't consistent. Just a few steps, then long silences. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A stick breaking. Not under pressure from a paw, but a crack like it snapped clean through. I sat up in my sleeping bag and reached for my light. I didn't turn it on yet. I just held it in my hand, aiming toward the door of the tent. I tried to slow my breathing. I couldn't tell if it was getting closer or just circling. It was like the sound vanished between bursts. I strained to hear more, but everything had gone still. Not silent, just still. Like the forest itself had noticed something and was holding its breath. That was worse than the noises. I sat frozen, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Minutes passed. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I imagined the steps. Maybe I exaggerated the crack. Maybe it was just my brain filling in gaps. And then I heard it again. Closer. A small rock rolling. That's what did it. Something had knocked a stone loose on the slope. It rolled down toward the creek, clicking and bouncing, then vanished. That was real. I couldn't pretend that part didn't happen. I unzipped the tent slowly, just enough to stick the flashlight through. I waited another second, bracing myself for what I might see, then clicked it on. Nothing. Just the trees, the slope, the shadowed line where the creek glimmered under the moonlight. I scanned back and forth, slowly, sweeping the beam across the terrain. I caught something, a shape, just at the edge of the light. I froze. The beam held steady. It was a stump. I felt like an idiot. Just a moss-covered stump angled in a way that looked like a crouched figure. I panned back across the slope. Still nothing. Just branches and undergrowth. My heart was still going hard, but nothing moved. No steps.
No crashing.
Just wind. I shut the light off and zipped the tent back up. Whatever it was, if it was anything at all, it was gone. I stayed sitting for a while, not trusting sleep. Eventually, I eased back onto my pad and lay still. Not asleep, but not awake either. Just listening, monitoring, holding my breath when the wind shifted or when the trees creaked louder than usual. But that was it. Nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more rocks, just the forest doing what it always does at night. When morning came, the light felt like a wave washing over me. I crawled out and stood, stretching, shaking the stiffness from my back and legs. The forest looked normal again. Ordinary. The sun broke through the trees in long golden slashes, lighting up steam rising from the damp ground. I walked down to the creek and splashed cold water on my face. I felt tired but calm, like the tension had drained out of me the second daylight hit. I did a slow walk around the area before packing up. Checked the slope, looked for tracks. I didn't see much. A few spots where moss had been kicked up. Could have been anything. I followed the marks down toward the creek but didn't see anything clear.
No prints. No scat.
Just scuffed ground and one half-buried rock that looked freshly disturbed. I didn't feel scared anymore, just small, like I'd been caught in something larger than me, something that didn't care one way or the other whether I was there. I packed up slow that morning, took my time getting my gear in order. I made coffee, stood with the cup in hand, breathing in the early air, listening to birds wake up the trees. Nothing about the place felt threatening now. It was the same forest as the night before, but with everything visible, it felt less like a place where danger lived and more like a place where I had simply let my thoughts go too far. And that's the real story, isn't it? Not what's out there, but what we bring with us. All that stuff we carry. Stress, fear, tension. It waits until we're still, until we stop moving and lie down in the dark. And then it presses its face against the tent wall and asks if we're really sure we're alone. That day, I hiked another 10 kilometers and camped again, deeper in the loop, near an old logging clearing. I slept fine that night.
No weird noises.
No broken twigs. Just sleep. Thick, dreamless, peaceful. And after 2 more days, I looped back to the trailhead and made it home. Didn't die. Thanks for the clarification. I've been on a lot of trips into the Canadian backcountry, but one of the few moments that has stayed stuck in my memory, clear as day, no matter how many years pass, happened on an island in the Clearwater Lake system. For people unfamiliar with the area, it's that massive expanse of lakes, rivers, and thick boreal forest between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg. More specifically, we were somewhere between Atikokan and Ignace, a stretch so remote that even the occasional float plane flying overhead feels like a foreign sound. It's the kind of place where, once you're deep in, you're really in it, no signal, no roads, no people. Just endless water and trees, and a silence that feels more alive than anything in the cities. A lot of people don't realize how vast Northern Ontario is until they're in it, with a paddle in their hands, gliding across a lake with nothing but the wind and loons for company. This was one of my first serious trips. I was a teenager, probably around 15. My sister was on the trip too, 2 years younger than me. We were part of a youth outdoor group that organized multi-day backcountry expeditions. It wasn't just canoeing, we learned all the basics of wilderness travel. How to pack, paddle, portage, build fires, hang food away from bears, set up camp, leave no trace, all of that. It wasn't cushy either. No cabins, no designated campsites with benches or outhouses. Just whatever flat spot we could find that looked dry and safe. We were about 5 or 6 days into the trip. It had been a long day of paddling. We'd worked through 2 short portages earlier that afternoon, both rough and rocky, the kind that feel longer than they are because the footing is bad and the bugs are relentless. The sun was starting to drop lower by the time we reached the island we planned to stay on. It wasn't a huge island, maybe a couple 100 meters across in either direction. The shoreline was a mix of rocks and sandy beach, with pine trees growing thick and tall over most of it. The interior was dense, full of tight underbrush, mossy rocks, deadfall. Not ideal for pitching tents, but the beach was flat and wide enough for all of us, and the sand was packed firm. The weather looked stable, no storm clouds, no wind, so we decided to camp directly on the beach, with the forest at our backs and the water a few meters away. My sister and I shared a 2-person tent. We were the only sibling pair in the group, which meant we were used to being together, even when we didn't talk much. We set up near the edge of the trees, just where the sand started to transition into roots and pine needles. A good spot, soft, dry, not too exposed. The other tents were spaced out nearby. Everyone was tired, so the routine moved quickly. We made a basic dinner, some kind of rice and lentils combo, if I remember right, cleaned up, stashed the food away in the canoes pulled up on shore, and got ready to turn in for the night. The air was perfectly still that evening. Not a single breeze. The lake was like glass, no ripples, no waves. The only sounds were distant loon calls and the occasional splash of fish. It was the kind of night that makes you forget the world exists outside the wilderness. I remember lying on my back in the tent, my sleeping bag only half zipped, the top of the tent open just enough to let the moonlight filter through the mesh. The sand beneath us gave just enough cushion to be comfortable, and the night was warm, even for Northern Ontario. I must have dozed off pretty quickly, because the next thing I remember was waking up in the middle of the night. Not startled, just awake. No reason that I could think of. It was that strange middle space between dreaming and full consciousness. I opened my eyes and looked up at the ceiling of the tent. Everything was quiet. Then I heard it, a single soft splash, not far away. It wasn't the sound of a fish jumping. I knew that sound, clean, sudden, brief. This was different. This was something entering the water or leaving it. A single slow splash, like a weight dipping into the shallows or brushing through them. I didn't move, just listened. Another few seconds passed, and then I heard something else. A slow, dragging sound on the sand. Very faint, like something long and smooth was pulling itself across the beach. I stayed frozen. My eyes were wide open now, but I couldn't see anything beyond the fabric of the tent. I was on the side closer to the water, my sister on the side closer to the trees. Whatever was moving outside was on her side. The sound continued, slow, steady, almost rhythmic, a kind of quiet scraping, not the sound of footsteps, no crunching of twigs or leaves, just sand moving under something long and low. It moved along the side of the tent, not fast, not erratic, just a slow pass, maybe a foot or two away from where we lay. I held my breath. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound. Every part of my body had gone still. My heartbeat sounded loud in my ears, louder than the noise outside. The movement stopped right near the corner where the zipper was. That's where our heads were. I lay there, frozen, trying to imagine what was out there. A bear? But bears don't move like that. They make noise. You'd hear their weight. You'd hear breathing. This wasn't that. It was quieter, more deliberate. I kept listening. Nothing. Then another splash, this time from farther away, down the beach toward where the canoes were pulled up. A softer splash, but it was there. And then more movement. Sounded like another one. The same dragging scrape in the sand, slow and steady, curving through the beach toward the tree line. Now there were two of them. That was the moment I really felt a shift from anxiety to fear. One strange visitor in the night was unnerving. Two meant something was going on. Some kind of pattern. Two quiet movements in the dark, both slithering past our tent without a sound from anyone else. I thought about waking my sister, but I didn't. I was afraid that even the sound of my sleeping bag rustling would bring whatever it was back to the tent. So I stayed still, unblinking, just listening for what felt like hours. But nothing else happened. No more splashes, no more movement. The sound stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. At some point, though I don't remember when, my body must have given out from exhaustion. I didn't fall asleep so much as shut down, like my brain couldn't stay in high alert forever. And eventually, my eyes just closed. My last thought before drifting off was that I'd check the sand in the morning, see if there was anything left behind. When I woke again, the sun was already up. The tent was bright with daylight. Birds were calling from the trees. My sister was still curled up in her sleeping bag, still asleep. No sign she'd heard a thing. I sat up slowly, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The beach looked peaceful. The lake was calm again. The canoes still pulled up where we left them. A few of the other campers were just starting to stir. Nothing out of place. Then I looked down. There, in the sand, maybe 2 or 3 feet from the side of the tent, were the marks. They weren't deep, but they were clear. 2 sets of slither tracks. One had passed just beside the tent, almost brushing it. The other had come up from the waterline and veered off toward the trees. Both were wide and smooth, weaving in soft curves through the sand. Not human, not animal prints, just long, single-track trails where something had dragged its body across the beach. Snakes. It had to be snakes. Big ones, from the size of the trails. I followed one set down the beach, and sure enough, it led directly into the water, right near where I'd heard the first splash. The other set led into the tree-line and disappeared into the underbrush. I stood there, staring at the trails, trying to make sense of it. Why had they come up on shore? What were they doing near the tent? What would have happened if we'd left food out, or if one of us had rolled over and brushed the side of the tent? I never found answers. We packed up that morning, had our usual oatmeal breakfast, and got back on the water. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Maybe I should have. But at that age, part of me didn't want to seem paranoid. Part of me didn't even want to think about it. I just kept it to myself, and we moved on to the next lake, the next portage, the next night in the bush. But that image stayed with me. The slow movement in the dark. The knowledge that something had been right outside, only a few inches from where we slept. The silence of it. The calm lake. The soft sand. The realization that nature doesn't need to roar to be unsettling. It can whisper, and it's just as loud. Years later, I still go on trips. I've paddled all over Ontario and into Manitoba. I've slept on rocky points and mossy clearings, under stars and through storms. But I never pitch my tent close to the water anymore. Not right on the edge. I always check the sand. I always look for trails. And I always remember that night on that island in the Clearwater Lake system, when the dark stayed quiet, but something was out there. That kind of quiet is its own kind of warning, and I never forgot it. The Great Dividing Range is one of those places that calls to you, even if you're not sure why. I've been hiking on and off in Australia for years, but this particular trip had been in the back of my mind for a while. I was drawn to the mountains, the forests, the stars. I wanted to feel that raw distance, the kind that only comes when the only barrier between you and the open sky is the thin shell of your own skin and sleeping bag. That summer, a few friends and I finally carved out the time. We planned a multi-day hike along a section of the range. Not the full thing, of course, but a good, solid leg of it, through open plateaus, grassy valleys, and thin trails that skirted the edges of dense gum tree forests. We were prepared, or so we thought. It was summer, and temperatures were expected to be warm and dry. Because of that, we decided to travel light. Sleeping bags, a shared tarp fly in case of rain, but no tents. The idea was to sleep under the stars each night, cook simple meals, carry just enough water and refill when we hit natural sources. We weren't rookies, we all had miles under our boots, and we were careful about our planning. Still, the bush has a way of humbling you, even when everything goes right. We set out from a small town that sat on the edge of the national park. The first couple of days were beautiful in that rugged, exhausting way. Days were long and hot, and we often broke into 2 or 3 silent hours of walking, not talking much, just sweating and moving. The land stretched out around us. Golden grass, boulders shaped by time, clusters of tall eucalyptus trees creaking quietly in the breeze. At night, the stars came out in numbers I'd never seen before. There was no light pollution out here. No sounds but the wind and the occasional skitter of movement in the grass. Some distant bird call. Sometimes just your own breath echoing in your ears. By the 4th day, we were about 2/3 through our planned route. We'd made decent time and were keeping spirits up, despite blisters and sunburn and tired legs. That night, we found a wide, open area nestled between 2 low ridges. A few stringy bark trees dotted the edge of the space, and a dry creek bed curved nearby. Beyond that, just bush and sky. It was perfect, or so it seemed. It didn't start out wrong. We cooked some couscous on a little stove, passed around water flasks, talked a bit. The sun had gone down quickly, and the ground was still warm under our mats. I remember brushing a few ants off the edge of my sleeping bag before I laid down, and not thinking anything of it. Bugs are always part of the deal in the bush. You just flick them off, zip up, and go to sleep. But I didn't sleep. First, it was nothing, just the usual rustling. Gum leaves brushing in the wind. A few moths fluttering around the light of a headlamp. I lay there, watching stars and letting my thoughts drift, expecting sleep to come soon. Then the itching started. First, I thought it was just dry skin. My arms had gotten a bit burned in the sun that day, and I'd probably missed a spot with the sunscreen. But it spread quickly. Neck, jawline, ears, tiny prickling sensations on my legs under the sleeping bag. I sat up and scratched absently, looked around. One of my friends was already out cold, snoring quietly. Another was rolling onto his side, adjusting his bag. No one else seemed bothered. I lay back down, but after a minute or two, I felt it again, like the brush of fine threads across my cheek. I flinched and sat up sharply this time, wiping at my face. That's when I saw it. A small, fuzzy caterpillar curled up near the edge of my sleeping bag, not far from my arm. It was about 2 inches long, thick with bristles, dark in color with lighter bands. I stared at it, then looked past it, and saw another, and another. They were everywhere. I turned on my headlamp, and the beam lit up dozens of them. They were crawling across the grass, the edges of my mat, and some even on the surface of my sleeping bag. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. A wave of crawling dread rose in my chest, the kind that makes your skin crawl before your brain has fully caught up. I brushed at myself in jerky movements, running my hands along my arms, chest, back, legs. Caterpillars fell from the folds of my bag. One had managed to wedge itself inside the edge of the zipper near my feet. I kicked the bag open, shaking it violently. I wasn't screaming. There was nothing supernatural going on, but my heart was pounding all the same. I was surrounded by insects, and not just a few, a full-blown infestation. They were coming out of the grass in waves, slow but persistent. I backed away, crunching grass underfoot, keeping the headlamp aimed low. The ground shimmered with their movement, hundreds of them. I looked toward my friends. They were all still asleep. Somehow, I wanted to wake them, but what would I even say? There was no danger in the usual sense. No predator, no storm, nothing chasing us. Just caterpillars. Just crawling, tickling, hair-covered caterpillars. Still, I couldn't lie back down. I dragged my mat closer to the base of one of the gum trees, then pulled my sleeping bag up onto a rock slab nearby, brushing off anything clinging to it. Even then, I couldn't relax. Every minute or so, I'd feel another tickle and have to check again. I couldn't tell if it was in my head or if they were still crawling on me. My skin itched constantly, even where nothing was touching me. At one point, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., I saw something else that made my blood go cold. It was the way they were moving, not just randomly but steadily, almost like they were being drawn to the warmth of our bodies or the salt of our sweat. I don't know, but they were converging on our little camp, that much was clear. I pulled the fly tarp over my bag like a shell, tucking the ends tight underneath. It wasn't a perfect seal, but it was the best I could do without a tent. The air under the tarp grew warm and humid fast, but I chose that over feeling their bristly little bodies brushing against my skin. Sleep came in broken bits. 10 minutes here, 20 there. Every time I stirred, I'd jerk awake thinking something was on my face or my arm. Once, I actually slapped myself in the forehead so hard I gave myself a bump. But I didn't care. I just wanted the sun to rise. And eventually, it did. Light crept over the ridgeline in slow, gray streaks. I peeled back the tarp and saw the grass still moving with them. There weren't as many now, but they were still there, crawling in slow circles down the dry creek bed, over rocks, some crushed underfoot, others still marching. A few had made it onto my boots. I stood up and shook everything out. My bag, my mat, my pack. I used a stick to brush some caterpillars off the sides of my gear. They clung stubbornly, gripping with those dozens of tiny feet. Eventually, the others woke. They noticed them then, the caterpillars all over the camp. One guy stepped in the middle of them barefoot while going to piss and just about jumped out of his skin. The mood changed from sleepy to annoyed to mildly disgusted. But still, we all agreed there was no danger. Just the gross factor. We packed up fast that morning. No one wanted to sit around and eat with the ground alive like that. We skipped our usual hot breakfast and munched on muesli bars while walking. After an hour or two on the trail, the caterpillars were behind us. We joked about it later, but I didn't laugh much. That night had sunk deep into my brain. I realized just how fragile comfort is when you're sleeping outside. One small shift, like a swarm of fuzzy caterpillars, and suddenly, the peaceful bush becomes a place you want to escape. It wasn't fear of death. It wasn't a predator. It was the invasion of personal space, the total disruption of rest, the unrelenting sensation of crawling, itching, and not being able to do a damn thing about it. We finished the hike a few days later without any more surprises. The views were incredible. The trails were hard but rewarding. We saw kangaroos, echidnas, even some wedge-tailed eagles circling far overhead. But even now, years later, when I think about that trip, it's not the stars or the cliffs that come to mind first. It's that night, under the stars, heart racing, skin crawling, lying awake while hundreds of hairy bodies crept past in the dark. And I haven't slept without a tent in the bush since. When I was in my early 20s, I was broke most of the time. I scraped together enough money to get by on cheap food, gas, and used gear. My car was falling apart, I had no health insurance, and my phone only worked on Wi-Fi, but I had an old pack, a decent sleeping bag, a thick wool blanket, and an old flashlight with some working batteries. I didn't really care about comfort then. I just wanted to be outdoors, to feel like I was away from people and the noise of life. That was something I craved more than anything: silence, space, and the kind of peace that comes when you're out in the woods alone. At the time, I was traveling around the West Coast. I'd just come from Oregon and was headed down into Northern California, mostly hugging the coast. I didn't have enough money for motels or campsites, so I did a lot of stealth camping, pulling off down random roads, sleeping in the car, or hiking a little ways into the woods and sleeping under the stars. One place I'd always wanted to spend the night was among the redwoods. Not at a campground or anything formal, just really out there in the middle of it, deep enough that I wouldn't see headlights or hear traffic. I figured if I was respectful and quiet and didn't leave trash or build fires, I'd be fine. I pulled off onto a small forest road somewhere off Highway 101, north of Eureka but south of Crescent City. I can't remember the name of the road or exactly where I parked. I didn't have GPS or a map, just a general sense of where I was from signs and what I'd glanced at in a gas station a couple hours earlier. It wasn't a trailhead or anything official, just a narrow dirt track that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. I eased my old Honda Civic down it until it got too rough, then parked in a wider patch of grass near the trees and threw my pack on. It was late afternoon by then, maybe 3 or 4. I knew I didn't have a ton of daylight left, so I walked in maybe half a mile, just far enough that I couldn't see the road or the car anymore. I wasn't trying to do a full backpacking trip or anything, just find a spot to lay down for the night where I wouldn't be bothered. The trees were massive, the ground soft with thick layers of pine needles and broken branches. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. Just the sound of the wind moving through the canopy and the occasional bird call. I remember thinking how it smelled like earth and bark and something sweet and old. Not musty, just thick, like the forest had been here forever and carried that weight. I found a spot in a sort of natural clearing where a few big redwoods formed a loose circle. The ground was soft but not damp, and there weren't too many branches or roots to deal with. I spread out the big wool blanket I'd brought. It was old and heavy, something I'd picked up in a thrift store for a few bucks, and unrolled my sleeping bag on top of it. Then I tucked another smaller blanket over the bag and laid down on it to test the feel. It was good enough. I wasn't expecting luxury. I had a small pack of crackers, a couple of energy bars, and a plastic bottle filled with tap water. That was dinner. I didn't even bother with a fire or a stove. I remember sitting for a while, leaning against my pack, just watching the light shift in the trees. The sun went down fast once it dipped below the canopy. The woods turned from golden to gray, and then into that deep, shadowy blue that comes just before full darkness. It wasn't cold, but I could feel the temperature dropping fast. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up, pulled the top blanket over myself, and stared up at the black silhouettes of the trees until my eyes got too heavy. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I remember, I was waking up in pitch darkness. The kind that doesn't feel natural at first. The kind where you wonder if your eyes are even open. The woods were dead quiet. I didn't hear anything. No wind. No birds. Not even the faint buzz of insects. It was the silence that woke me, I think. That sudden sense that something had changed. I wasn't scared. Not yet, just aware. I fumbled around in the dark and found my flashlight, then clicked it on. The beam was weak, the batteries already fading, but it worked. I swept it across the trees first, making sure I wasn't hearing animals or people or anything like that. Nothing. Then I lowered it to check around the blanket. That's when I saw them. Spiders. Dozens of them. All around the edge of the blanket, spaced evenly like some kind of border. They weren't touching the blanket, just standing right at the edge. Long-legged, black or dark brown, each about the size of my palm if you included the legs. They weren't tangled together or crawling over one another. They were still, all of them, standing leg to leg in a near-perfect ring, every one of them facing outward into the woods. I didn't move, just stared for a while, trying to understand what I was seeing. They weren't moving toward me. They weren't even facing me, just standing in this line like sentries or guards or, I don't know, waiting. My brain ran through everything I knew about spiders, which wasn't much. I figured they were hunting. Maybe the warmth from my body and the blanket had attracted bugs. And these things were taking up spots where prey might wander in from the forest. It made some kind of sense, even if it didn't explain how they were all the same type, all spread evenly, all acting together. I pulled the flashlight back toward my chest and flicked it off. I didn't want to spook them or attract more. I could still feel them there, even with the light gone, this strange ring around me. I curled the top blanket tighter around myself, made sure the sleeping bag was zipped all the way up, then lay perfectly still. I didn't fall asleep right away. I just lay there with my heart ticking and my ears tuned to every sound. But nothing happened. No skittering across the blanket. No crawling up the sides. Eventually, I drifted off again. When I woke up the second time, it was light. Early morning light filtering through the trees, gray and thin but enough to see clearly. I sat up slowly and looked around. Nothing.
No spiders.
No trace of them. The blanket was undisturbed. The woods were calm again, full of birdsong and rustling leaves, like the night had never happened. I got out of the sleeping bag slowly and checked around the edges of the blanket. No webs, no legs, no carcasses. Just a few pine needles and small twigs. I packed everything up quickly, still watching the ground around me. I wasn't scared anymore, just confused and curious, but I didn't stick around to figure anything out. I hiked back toward the car, maybe a little faster than usual. I kept checking my boots to make sure nothing was crawling up inside them. Every tickle on my leg made me stop and sweat, but there was nothing, just that lingering image in my head. Dozens of spiders standing guard, not trying to eat me or chase me, just holding the line. Like I was the eye of a storm I didn't understand. I never saw anything like that again. I've camped in deserts, in forests, on beaches and mountains and snow-covered plains. I've seen black widows in woodpiles and wolf spiders in outhouses, but nothing like that ring in the redwoods. I told myself later that it had to be some kind of natural behavior. Maybe the warmth from my body brought out small insects, and the spiders were just opportunists. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe they were drawn to the fabric of the blanket or the scent of food on my hands. But it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt organized, like there was something I wasn't seeing, something just beneath the surface of it. The way they were spaced, the way they stood still, all facing the same direction, the way they vanished with the dawn like they'd never been there. I didn't talk about it much afterward, not because I thought people wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know how to describe it without sounding like I was adding something that wasn't there. There was nothing supernatural, nothing dramatic, just a night in the forest, surrounded by spiders, all standing silently in the dark like they were waiting for something, and then gone. Years later, I read something about certain spider species being drawn to warm microclimates at night, like around sleeping animals where the air is just a little warmer, a little more humid. It made sense. I created a little island of warmth, and maybe that attracted the insects, and then the spiders came to feed. But that still didn't explain the behavior, the arrangement, the way they all disappeared at once without a trace. The redwoods are old. That forest has its own rhythm, its own laws. Things live out there that we don't see, and sometimes you become part of that world for a night. I was lucky nothing went wrong. They didn't crawl over me or into my bag. They didn't bite or sting. They just stood there and then they were gone. But I still think about it sometimes. I wonder how many nights I've slept outside with things around me I never saw, never heard, never noticed. That was one of the few times I saw the shape of something I couldn't quite name. A moment when nature gathered itself around me and reminded me that I was just a visitor. And in the quiet of that night, the spiders stood watch while I slept. I haven't slept straight on the ground since then. Even now, years later, I always bring a tent or at least a cot or hammock. Something to lift me just a little off the earth. Not out of fear exactly, just out of respect. That forest didn't owe me anything, but it let me leave, and I never forgot. I've always liked hiking alone. There's something about the silence, the space, the slow rhythm of your own steps on dirt that feels more honest than most things in the world. That quietness out there, no cars, no people, no digital noise, lets you get closer to who you are when there's nothing left to distract you. I never used to think much about safety or what could go wrong out there. I packed well, I knew my trails, I stuck to daytime routes, and I figured that was enough. It was early October when I decided to hike a ridge trail that cut through a long stretch of forest not far from the edge of a large state park. I don't want to name it here. It was one of those areas that hadn't been mapped in much detail, and I'd found it by accident the year before when looking at satellite views of a different trail. You could just make out an old fire road winding through a section of heavy woods and granite rock outcroppings. No clear start or end, no signage, just a rough line like an old scar on the land. That kind of thing pulls at me. So that day, I set out before sunrise and drove to the far end of a public trail, parked, and bushwhacked toward where I believed the hidden route started. The air was cool, the sky gray with low clouds. Everything smelled damp, like the ground had just dried after days of rain. I followed deer trails and loose gravel runs until I found a narrow, crumbling path that led into thicker woods. It matched the line I'd seen on the satellite map almost exactly. I followed it, feeling a strange sort of excitement. I'd brought a small pack with me, water, food, flashlight, first aid, the usual. I wasn't planning to camp overnight, just to get to this rocky overlook I'd seen from above and then head back before sunset. The trail was rough. Roots jutted out like bones from the ground, and dead branches littered the way. But it was definitely a man-made route, an old one, probably from when the area had been used for logging or fire watch. I followed it for hours. Sometimes I'd stop and just listen. No wind, no birds, just silence, like the woods were holding their breath. Eventually, I reached the ridge. It was steeper than I'd expected, more like a long spine of rock breaking through the trees. The granite was pale, almost white in places, and covered in lichen and cracks. It wasn't easy climbing, but I made it up the slope and stood looking out over the forest below. No people, no roads, nothing but trees and hills stretching for miles. I dropped my pack, drank some water, and sat down on a flat slab of rock near the edge. The view was good. The silence was better. I sat there a while, maybe 30 minutes, maybe more. Time blurs in places like that. At some point, I noticed a movement in the corner of my eye. Something small and black slipping through the brush behind me. It was a cat. A stray, small and thin, with short black fur and eyes that seemed too bright for its body. It stepped out slowly, almost like it was testing the air. It didn't meow, didn't approach, just walked to a flat patch of stone about 10 feet away and sat down. It didn't take its eyes off me. I figured maybe someone had abandoned it near the trail, or maybe it had been born in the woods. Either way, I felt a stab of guilt. I pulled a bit of granola from my pocket and tossed it toward the cat. It didn't move, just watched. The strange thing was how still it was. It didn't seem scared, or interested in food, or even bothered by my presence. It just sat there, staring at me, alert. I tried to ignore it. I figured it'd lose interest and disappear back into the woods. But it didn't. I laid back on the rock, stretched out, closed my eyes for a bit. When I opened them, the cat was still there. Same spot, same posture, watching me. At first, it didn't bother me, but the longer I sat there, the more I started to feel uneasy. I kept looking around. I don't know why, just a feeling, like I was being watched by something else, something I couldn't see. Not the cat, something out past the trees, something that made the cat stay. I sat up, looked down the way I'd come. The trail wasn't far. I could pack up and be back near the main road in a few hours. But something about the stillness made me want to stay put, like movement would draw attention. That's when I heard the sound. It was low, almost like a shuffle, not footsteps, more like dragging. It came from the trees behind the cat. The cat's ears twitched, but it didn't turn its head. It just kept looking at me, tail flicking slightly. I stayed frozen. I didn't move. The dragging stopped. Then silence again. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I knew what I'd heard. I know the sounds of animals, deer, squirrels, even bear. This was none of those. It wasn't fast, wasn't natural. It was slow, heavy, like something being pulled. The cat stood up. Its back arched slightly, and it moved closer to me. Still silent, still staring at me, but now standing between me and the woods, like a barrier. I waited. Then I heard the sound again, closer this time. A scrape against bark, a rustle of leaves. I grabbed my pack and stood up slowly. I didn't run. I didn't want to. It felt wrong, like sudden movement would bring it closer. Whatever it was. The cat walked backward as I walked to the other side of the ridge, toward a steeper slope that led to a dry wash. I wasn't planning to go that way, but the trail I came up from was now in the same direction as the noise. So I went down the other side. The slope was sharp, covered in loose rock and broken branches. I slipped more than once, scraping my hands on the stone, grabbing at roots. The cat followed, keeping just a little ahead of me. Never looking back, but never going too far. When I reached the bottom of the wash, I stopped to breathe. My legs were shaking. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat. The cat stood on a boulder nearby, tail twitching, still watching the ridge. Then I heard it again. Above me now. A slow, dragging scrape. Then silence. I waited, heart pounding. After a few minutes, I kept moving. The cat stayed with me. I followed the dry wash for over an hour, heading away from the ridge, deeper into the woods. I didn't know where I was going. I just kept moving, hoping to find a trail, a marker, anything. The cat stayed close, always just ahead or just behind, never too far. Eventually, I found a break in the trees where sunlight poured through. It led to a clearing, half overgrown, where an old stone foundation sat like the bones of a house. I recognized it from the satellite map. It was near an old turnoff that ran back toward the road. I stepped into the clearing. The cat stopped at the edge, didn't follow. I waited, then turned to look at it. It was staring past me, back into the trees. Its body was low, tense. Then it bolted, not toward me, not into the clearing. It ran back the way we'd come, fast and low, vanishing into the woods like a shadow. I didn't understand, but I didn't stay. I picked a direction and walked fast, then ran. I tripped more than once, scraped my knee, tore my pack, but I didn't stop. It took me another 2 hours to find the road. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a long time. I locked the doors. I didn't look back at the trees. I just stared through the windshield, breathing, shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't see the cat again. I've gone back to that trail once, months later, just to stand at the edge and look. I didn't go in. I just stood there and listened. Sometimes I think the cat wasn't there for me. Not exactly. Maybe it knew something was in those woods. Maybe it had lived there long enough to know where it was safe and where it wasn't. Maybe when it saw me sitting on that rock, it understood I didn't know the difference. It didn't try to scare me. It didn't run. It just stayed until I was far enough away. And when it left, fast, sudden, silent, it was like it knew its job was done. I still don't know what I heard in those trees. I'll never know. I just know that something was there, and it wasn't supposed to be. And I think that cat, thin, wild, silent, guarded me the only way it could, by not leaving until I was safe.